This girl lost her father and was dumped in a landfill, all because of her stepmother, but she held a grudge against her, and 13 years later returned with a plan in mind. What happened after 13 years will shock you. Leave your comment and subscribe to the channel to support my work. The night was especially cold on the outskirts of New Jersey when the luxury car stopped near the municipal landfill. Emily, only 7 years old, was asleep in the back seat, exhausted after days of crying over her father's death. Mildred looked at the girl in the rearview mirror, her face twisted in a look of disdain. She had planned every detail of that moment since she caused the accident that killed George. "Wake up," she ordered sharply, shaking Emily. The girl opened her eyes, startled, taking a few seconds to realize she wasn't in her bed. The strong smell of garbage filled the car, even with the windows closed. "Aunt Mildred, where are we?" Emily asked, her voice choked with fear. Her small hands clutched tightly to the rag doll her father had given her on her last birthday. "Get out of the car, now!" Mildred commanded, pulling the girl by the arm violently. Emily stumbled as she was dragged out, her legs wobbly from sleep and the terror she was beginning to feel. The landfill stretched out like a black sea before her, mountains and mountains of waste disappearing into the darkness. The icy wind cut her face, bringing with it the nauseating odor of decomposition. Emily squeezed the doll against her chest, tears beginning to flow. "Please, Aunt Mildred, I want to go home," she pleaded, trying to hold her stepmother's hand. Mildred repelled her with a shove that made the girl fall seated on the damp earth. "Your home is here now," Mildred declared, her voice full of cruelty. "Your father is dead, and I'm not going to waste my life taking care of his daughter." Emily began to sob, her small body trembling with cold and fear. "But Daddy said you would take care of me. He trusted you." "Your father was an idiot who believed everything I said," Mildred cut in, a malicious smile forming on her red-painted lips. "Did he really think I was going to settle for that mediocre life? It was just a stepping stone to get where I wanted to be." The girl didn't completely understand what Mildred was saying, but she felt in her childish heart the weight of the betrayal. She tried to get up, but Mildred pushed her again. "Stay there. If you try to follow me, it will be much worse," she threatened, walking back to the car. Her high heels sank into the muddy ground. "Don't leave me here," Emily shouted, despair taking over. "Please, I promise to be good." Mildred got in the car and started the engine. The noise startled some buzzards that were sleeping nearby, their black wings flapping against the starless sky. Emily ran after the vehicle, her little legs struggling against the uneven terrain. "Come back! Please, come back!" she shouted, until her lungs burned. But the car had already disappeared into the darkness, leaving only a cloud of dust behind. Emily fell to her knees, hugging her doll with all her strength. The tears now ran freely down her dirty face. She was alone, completely alone in the world. The wind blew harder, bringing with it the distant sound of barking dogs. Terrified, the girl crawled to a nearby pile of garbage, trying to protect herself from the cold. The smell was unbearable, but she had no choice. She leaned against a piece of old cardboard, trembling from head to toe. "Daddy," she whispered, between sobs, "why did you have to go away? Why did you leave me with her?" The hours dragged on endlessly that endless night. Every noise, every movement in the shadows made her heart race. She was sure that horrible monsters would appear at any moment to devour her. The sky began to clear when Emily heard footsteps approaching. She shrank even more, trying to hide behind the cardboard. A flashlight beam cut through the dimness, making her close her eyes tightly. "Good heavens!" exclaimed a female voice. "There's a child here!" Emily opened her eyes slightly, distinguishing the silhouette of a middle-aged black woman. Her round face conveyed kindness, but the girl was too terrified to trust anyone. "Calm down, little one," the woman said, crouching down slowly. "My name is Shirley. I won't hurt you." The woman took off an old coat she was wearing and held it out to Emily. "You must be freezing. Come with me. I'll take you to a warm place." Emily hesitated, clutching her doll even tighter. You won't hurt me." "Never, honey," Shirley assured, her voice as soft as a hug. "Here at the landfill, we take care of each other. You're safe now." With faltering steps, Emily approached. "Shirley." The woman wrapped her in the coat gently, as if she were dealing with something precious and fragile. "How did you end up here, sweetie?" asked Shirley, as she guided her through the mountains of garbage. Emily opened her mouth to answer, but the words wouldn't come out. How could she explain that her own stepmother, the woman her father had entrusted her life to, had abandoned her as if she were a worthless object? "It's okay," said Shirley, noticing her discomfort. "You don't have to talk about it now. Let's take care of getting some hot food in that little tummy first." As they walked, Emily looked back one last time at the place where she had been abandoned. Something inside her changed that night, an innocence that would never be recovered. She didn't know it yet, but that was just the beginning of a long journey of pain and overcoming. The first few days at the landfill were a nightmare for Emily. Shirley's shack, built with old boards and pieces of tin, housed 5 other children in similar situations. Each carried their own story of abandonment, but no one talked about it. It was like a silent agreement between little warriors. The smell of garbage never went away completely. Even after bathing, even with clean clothes that Shirley got through donations, the odor seemed ingrained in their skin, a constant reminder of their reality. Emily slept, clutching her doll, her only link to the life she had lost, crying softly, so as not to wake the other children. One particularly hot morning, while helping Shirley sort recyclables, Emily met Daniel. He appeared suddenly, emerging from behind a mountain of garbage like a small ghost covered in dirt. He was about the same age as her, but his green eyes carried an ancient sadness. "Need help?" he asked, already squatting beside her. His small, agile hands worked quickly, separating plastic, metal, and paper with the experience of someone who had been doing it for a long time. "What's your name?" Emily asked timidly, watching the boy out of the corner of her eye. "Daniel," he replied, without stopping his work. "You're the new one that Mrs. Shirley brought, right? I saw you when you arrived." Emily nodded, feeling the tears wanting to return. Daniel noticed and, in a surprisingly kind gesture, offered her a piece of candy he had in his pocket. "Here, it's strawberry. I found it yesterday in a garbage bag from the supermarket. It was still sealed," he said with a shy smile. "Don't cry. Here we learn to be strong." That small gesture of kindness touched Emily deeply. It was the first time since she arrived that someone close to her age had shown her kindness. The candy was a little melted, but to Emily it tasted like the sweetest thing in the world. As the days passed, Daniel became a constant presence. He knew every corner of the landfill, knew exactly where to find the most valuable things and, more importantly, where it was safe to step. He taught Emily to identify the metals that were worth more, to avoid the places where the ground was unstable, to protect herself from the rats that appeared at night. "My mom left me here 3 years ago," he said one afternoon, while sharing a stale loaf of bread they had found. "She cried a lot when she brought me. She said she would come back, but she never showed up again." Emily wanted to tell her own story, to talk about Mildred, about her father, about the life she had before. But the words were stuck in her throat, as if saying them aloud made everything even more real. Daniel seemed to understand her silence. On nights when nightmares woke her up screaming, he was the one who held her hand until she fell back asleep. When the older boys tried to steal her doll, Daniel faced them all, even though he was smaller. "It's the only thing she has from her father," he shouted, his fists raised in a fighting stance. "Leave her alone!" Shirley watched the friendship of the two with a mixture of joy and concern. She knew that in the landfill, deep bonds could be as dangerous as they were comforting. People left, were taken away, disappeared without a trace. It was better not to get too attached, but it was impossible not to get attached to Daniel. He had a special way of making Emily smile, even on the most difficult days. When the garbage truck arrived bringing new treasures, as he called them, the two ran together to be the first to rummage. It was almost like a game that made them forget for a few moments the harshness of their lives. "One day, I'm going to be a baseball player," Daniel confided one night while watching the stars lying on an old mattress. "I'm going to play on a big team, make a lot of money, and get everyone out of here." Emily listened to his dreams in silence, wishing she could believe in them too. But her nights were still populated by nightmares where Mildred appeared, her face distorted in a mask of cruelty, abandoning her repeatedly. Time passed, and little by little, Emily learned to survive. Her hands, once soft and protected, developed calluses. Her fair skin gained a permanently ashen tone from the soot that hung in the air. But her eyes, those that had once shone with joy in her father's house, now carried a shadow that no child should know. One particularly hot afternoon, while rummaging through a newly arrived pile of hospital waste, something Shirley always warned them not to do, Daniel found something that would change their lives forever. "Look at this," he exclaimed, pulling a yellowed envelope out of a box. "There's money in here." Emily ran to see, her heart racing with the discovery. Inside the envelope were several bills, some stained with what looked like coffee, but still usable. "How much do you think there is?" she asked as Daniel counted quickly. "Almost $200, he replied, his eyes shining with excitement. "Emily, do you know what this means? We can buy real food. We can—" But before he could finish the sentence, a shadow fell over them. It was Kevin, one of the most violent teenagers in the landfill, known for stealing the belongings of the weaker ones. "What a coincidence to find you here," he said with a wicked smile, approaching dangerously. "What do you have there?" Daniel quickly hid the envelope behind his back, placing himself in front of Emily. "Nothing that concerns you, Kevin. Go away." "Don't be like that, brat," Kevin growled, advancing threateningly. "Give me that envelope now, or you two will regret it." What happened next was so fast that Emily barely had time to process. Daniel pushed the envelope into her hands and shouted, "Run!" before throwing himself at Kevin, giving her time to escape. Emily ran as she had never run before, her heart beating so hard it felt like it was going to explode. Behind her, she could hear the sounds of the fight, Daniel's screams mixing with Kevin's threats. When she finally reached Shirley's shack, she was breathless and shaking. Minutes later, which seemed like hours, Daniel appeared. His face was bruised, a trickle of blood ran from his nose, but his eyes gleamed with triumph. "I managed to escape," he announced, falling exhausted beside her. "And the best part, he has no idea where you ran with the money." That night, while sharing a piece of cake that Shirley had bought with part of the money they found, Emily realized that even in the midst of so much suffering, she had found something precious, a true friend. What she didn't know was that this friendship would be tested in ways that no child should face, and that fate had very different plans for the two of them. While Emily struggled to survive in the landfill, Mildred lived her days of glory. George's funeral had been a spectacle of hypocrisy, with her perfectly playing the role of the inconsolable widow. Her false tears won the sympathy of everyone, especially of Ryan Sterling, the famous baseball player who, unknowingly, had been a fundamental part of her plan. In fact, on that fateful night, it wasn't Ryan who ran over George. Mildred had meticulously orchestrated everything, She chased her husband on the dark road and hit him with her car. When she saw Ryan approaching at high speed, she threw her own vehicle into a ravine and hid. The player, disoriented by the heavy rain, didn't even realize that he had run over a lifeless body. Now, 3 months after the tragedy, Mildred savored every moment of her new life. She was sitting on the balcony of her luxurious penthouse, sipping champagne while watching the sunset over Malibu Beach, the engagement ring on her finger, a flashy diamond that Ryan had given her the night before, shone as much as her smile of satisfaction. "Ma'am, Mr. Sterling has just arrived," announced the maid, interrupting her thoughts. Mildred adjusted her silk dress and rehearsed her best expression of vulnerability. Ryan entered, still wearing his team uniform, his handsome face marked by the worry he always carried since the supposed accident. "How are you today, my love?" he asked, kissing her gently. "Were you able to get some rest?" "I tried," she replied with a studied sigh. "But the memories, you know how difficult it is." Ryan hugged her, his strong body conveying the comfort she pretended to need. "It will pass, sweetheart. I'm here with you." Mildred snuggled into his chest, hiding a smile of triumph. It was so easy to manipulate Ryan. His guilt over the supposed hit-and-run made him completely blind to her true motives. "Honey," she began using her sweetest tone, "I've been thinking, maybe it's time to make some changes in my life, to help overcome all this." "What kind of changes?" he asked, always accommodating. "Well, this house, it has so many memories. Sometimes I wake up in the middle of the night and feel like George is still here, and Emily—" Her voice faltered deliberately when mentioning her stepdaughter's name. "I still can't believe she ran away like that," Ryan commented, the guilt weighing even more heavily in his voice. Such a small child. Mildred held back the fake tears she had prepared. The story she had invented about Emily's disappearance was perfect. The girl, traumatized by her father's death, had run away during the night. She, of course, had searched everywhere possible, contacted the police, done everything a dedicated stepmother would do. "Maybe," she continued, carefully choosing her words, "maybe it's time to accept that she's not coming back, and that I need to move on." Ryan hugged her tighter. "What do you want to do?" "I was thinking we could sell this penthouse and buy a bigger house in a gated community, a new place without ghosts of the past." She paused calculatedly. "And maybe it's time to think about starting our own family." Ryan's face lit up. "You want to have children?" "Not exactly," she replied, preparing her next move. "Actually, I was thinking about adoption. There are so many children needing a home. And after losing Emily, I feel like it could be a way of healing for both of us." The manipulation was perfect. Ryan, who carried the weight of guilt for the supposed hit-and-run of George and the disappearance of Emily, saw in the idea a chance for redemption. What Ryan didn't know was that Mildred already had a specific child in mind. Daniel, her biological son with Carl, her longtime lover, was exactly where she had left him years ago, in the landfill. It was time to bring him home, not out of maternal love, but as another piece in her game of manipulations. That same night, while Ryan was sleeping, Mildred met secretly with Carl in a bar far from downtown. He was still the same as always, handsome, dangerous, and completely submissive to her charms. "Everything is ready," she said, passing him an envelope under the table. "Tomorrow, you go to the landfill and bring Daniel. But remember, he can't know that you're his father. For all intents and purposes, he's just another abandoned child that we're going to adopt." Carl counted the money in the envelope, his face hardened by greed. "What if he recognizes me? It's been a while, but children have good memories." "He was 4 years old when we left him there," Mildred replied coldly. "Besides, you've only seen him twice in your life. Trust me, it will be all right." As she returned home that night, Mildred couldn't contain her satisfaction. Her plan was unfolding perfectly. Soon, she would have Daniel back, not because she missed him, but because she needed an heir to Ryan's fortune. The boy would be raised as the baseball player's son, guaranteeing his share in the inheritance. What Mildred didn't know was that her plan had a serious flaw. She wasn't counting on the strong friendship that had formed between Daniel and Emily in the landfill, a connection that years later would come back to haunt her. The next morning, Mildred woke up early and began to prepare the room that would be Daniel's. Ryan watched her with adoration, completely enveloped by her false kindness. "You have such a big heart," he said, hugging her from behind. "Giving a home to an abandoned child, you're amazing." Mildred smiled, savoring her own cunning. In a few hours, Carl would be at the landfill to pick up Daniel. The boy would be brought home, coincidentally, chosen from among dozens of other children. She had already bribed all the social services, employees she needed, ensuring that the adoption was quick and without questions. What she didn't imagine was that, at that very moment, Emily and Daniel were sharing their last moment together in the landfill, a pure friendship that contrasted grotesquely with her manipulations and lies. When the phone rang late that afternoon, Mildred answered with barely contained anxiety. It was Carl. "It's done," he said dryly. "We're on our way." Mildred hung up the phone and turned to Ryan, who was watching television distractedly. "Honey," the social worker called, "they found a child who matches our profile perfectly, a 10-year-old boy. We can meet him today." Ryan smiled, completely oblivious to the macabre game he was about to enter. "What wonderful news! I can't wait to meet him." Mildred smiled back, but her eyes remained as cold as ice. Once again, she had gotten exactly what she wanted. Once again, she had manipulated all the pieces in her favor. Or at least, that's what she thought. The day Daniel was taken from the landfill began like any other. He and Emily were sitting on an old mattress, sharing a piece of stale bread that Shirley had managed to get, when a shiny black car stopped at the entrance to the landfill. The vehicle seemed out of place in that scene of misery, like a jewel lost in the trash. "What a nice car," Daniel commented, his green eyes shining with admiration. Since he was little, he dreamed of luxurious cars and a life different from that one. 3 people got out of the car: a tall man in a suit who introduced himself as a social worker, a woman with glasses carrying a folder, and a dark-haired man who stayed a little away, watching everything with a strange look that made Emily feel uncomfortable. "Good morning," said the man in the suit, approaching Shirley, who was already coming to meet them. "We are looking for children for adoption. We have a very special couple interested in giving a home to a boy." Emily's heart tightened instantly. She looked at Daniel, who was still fascinated by the car, and felt an inexplicable fear grow inside her. Something about that situation didn't seem right. The adults talked for a few minutes, while the children from the landfill approached curiously. The dark-haired man remained standing, his gaze now fixed on Daniel in a way that made Emily move closer to her friend, as if she wanted to protect him. "That one," said the dark-haired man suddenly, pointing to Daniel. "He's exactly the profile we're looking for." Everything happened very quickly after that. The woman with glasses approached. Daniel, with an artificial smile, began asking questions about his age, his time in the landfill, if he had any family. Daniel answered mechanically, still hypnotized by the idea of getting out of that life. "Would you like to have a real family?" she asked. "A nice house, food on the table, being able to study?" Daniel looked at Emily, his eyes now full of conflict. "But what about Emily?" "Unfortunately," said the woman, her tone falsely regretful, "the family can only adopt one child at the moment." Emily felt as if something cold was spreading through her body. She couldn't lose Daniel. He was her only friend, her only family besides Shirley. But at the same time, How could she ask him to refuse a chance to have a better life? Go, she whispered, swallowing the cry that threatened to explode. You've always wanted this. You've always dreamed of being a baseball player. Daniel hugged her tightly, his tears wetting his friend's dirty shoulder. I'll come back for you, he promised. When I have a big house, I'll come get you, I swear. Shirley watched the scene with teary eyes. She knew, with the wisdom that only years of life in the landfill could give, that promises like that were rarely kept. The children who left there when they were lucky enough to be adopted never came back. We need to go, said the man in the suit, consulting his expensive watch. The adoptive parents are waiting. Daniel was taken to the car, carrying only a small bundle with his few belongings. Before getting into the vehicle, he turned one last time to Emily. Don't forget me, he shouted. Never, she replied, the tears now running freely down her face. The car left, raising a cloud of dust that made everyone cough. Emily remained standing, looking at the spot where the vehicle had disappeared. Long after the dust settled, that night, for the first time since arriving at the landfill, Emily slept completely alone. Not even her doll could comfort her. The empty space beside her, where Daniel used to sleep, seemed to swallow her in her loneliness. Meanwhile, a few miles away, in a luxurious mansion in Beverly Hills, Daniel was introduced to his new home. The place was so big and beautiful that he could hardly believe his eyes. Everything shone, from the marble floor to the crystal chandeliers. On the ceiling, Ryan and Mildred were waiting for him in the main room. The baseball player had a genuinely warm smile, but something in Mildred's eyes made Daniel feel uncomfortable, although he couldn't explain why. Welcome to your new home, son, said Ryan, reaching out to hug him. Daniel returned the hug timidly, still trying to process everything that was happening. In a matter of hours, he had gone from the landfill to a palace. From today, your name will be Brian, announced Mildred, her voice sweet, but with a tone that did not allow for contradiction. Brian Sterling. Isn't it a beautiful name, honey? Ryan agreed enthusiastically, but Daniel, now Brian, felt as if they were tearing something away from him. His name was one of the few things that still connected him to his past, to who he really was. Let's show you your room, said Ryan, guiding him upstairs. The room was bigger than Shirley's entire shack. It had a huge bed with soft sheets, a closet full of new clothes, and even a state-of-the-art video game. Tomorrow we'll start the procedures for your enrollment in school, Ryan explained. And I'm also going to sign you up for baseball training. Who knows, maybe you'll follow in your new dad's footsteps. Daniel, no, Brian, he needed to get used to the new name, nodded mechanically. Everything seemed like a dream he was afraid to wake up from. When he was finally alone in the room, he sat on the soft bed and took out from his bundle the only object he had brought from the landfill. A small, broken plastic car that Emily had found for him. Tears began to fall as the longing for his friend squeezed his heart. How was she now? Was she crying too? Would he ever be able to fulfill his promise to come back for her? In the weeks that followed, Brian was introduced to a completely new life. Designer clothes, plenty of food, etiquette, classes, private school. Ryan proved to be a loving and present father, always encouraging his interest in baseball. Mildred, on the other hand, maintained a calculated distance. Her demonstrations of affection seemed rehearsed, as if she were acting in a play. Sometimes, when she thought no one was watching, she gave strange looks to Brian, almost as if she were evaluating him. The boy also began to have strange dreams, fragments of memories that he couldn't fully understand. A woman crying, a man similar to the one who had picked him up from the landfill, a house different from the one he lived in before the landfill. One morning, while having breakfast, Brian mustered the courage to ask the question that tormented him. Dad, can we visit the landfill? I have a friend there that I promised. Never talk about that place again, Mildred cut in sharply before Ryan could answer. Her face was pale with anger. That's your past. Now you're a Sterling, and Sterlings don't mix with those kinds of people. Ryan seemed uncomfortable with his wife's reaction, but he didn't contradict her. Your mom is right, son. It's better to leave the past behind. Let's focus on your future. Brian lowered his head, swallowing the tears along with his coffee. That night, he hid the plastic car at the bottom of a drawer. Maybe Mildred was right. Maybe it was better to forget everything. But as time passed and Brian adapted to his new life, Emily remained as a memory that refused to fade. In the quietest moments, when he was alone in his luxurious room, he could still hear her voice. Don't forget me. And even without knowing it, the promise he had made that day remained alive in his heart, waiting for the right moment to be fulfilled. 3 months after Daniel's departure, life in the landfill had become unbearable for Emily. Every corner, every mountain of waste brought a memory of her friend. At night, lying on her thin mattress, she imagined how he would be, if he was happy in his new family, if he still remembered her. It was on one of those sleepless nights that Shirley entered, the shack with a different expression on her face. The woman sat beside Emily, her eyes shining in a way that the girl had never seen before. "Honey," she began, her voice soft as always, "we need to talk. Earlier today I received a very special visit." Emily sat up, hugging her doll tightly. After what had happened with Daniel, any mention of visits put her on alert. "An Argentinian couple," Shirley continued. "Very good people who can't have children. They came to the United States especially to adopt a girl." She paused, studying Emily's reaction. "And they fell in love with you." Emily's heart began to beat faster. But I don't want to leave," she whispered, although part of her knew she was lying. Shirley took her small hands in hers. "Listen, my love. You're too special to spend your life in this place. God put these angels in our path for a reason. They can give you a life that I can never offer." Tears began to run down Emily's face. "But what if they're bad like Aunt Mildred?" Her stepmother's name still sent shivers down Emily's spine. Shirley hugged her tightly. "They're not, honey. I know how to recognize bad people when I see them. Michael and Carmen Montoya are different. They have love in their eyes when they look at you." The next day, Emily met the couple. Michael was a tall man with graying hair and a gentle smile. Carmen had almond-shaped eyes and an accent that made the words dance in a funny way. They brought gifts, new clothes, a porcelain doll, even chocolates. "We want you to come live with us in Los Angeles," said Carmen, kneeling down to be at Emily's height. "But only if you want to. We're not going to force you into anything." It was different from how it had been with Daniel. No one was rushing things. No one was making empty promises. Michael and Carmen visited the landfill every day for a week, always bringing something new, always talking, always respecting Emily's space. "In our house, there's a room just for you," Carmen said on one of the visits. "We painted it yellow because Shirley told us that it's your favorite color. It has a large window that overlooks a garden full of flowers." Little by little, Emily was lowering her defenses. The couple was really different from everything she had known since her father's death. There was no falsehood in their gestures. There wasn't that cold glint in their eyes that she had always noticed in Mildred. The night before leaving, Emily couldn't sleep. She kept looking at the stars through the cracks in the roof of the shack, thinking about everything she was leaving behind. She thought about Daniel, about how he had also left for a new life. Was she doing the right thing? Shirley entered silently and sat beside her. "Can't sleep, honey." Emily shook her head. "I'm scared, Mrs. Shirley. What if I never see Daniel again? What if I forget him?" The woman smiled sadly. "Some people we never forget, even if life takes us down different paths. Daniel will always be here," she said, touching Emily's chest. "In your heart." The next morning, The farewell was painful. All the children from the landfill came to say goodbye, some crying, others trying to pretend they didn't care. Shirley hugged Emily for a long time, her tears wetting the girl's hair. "Be happy, honey," she whispered, "and never forget who you are." The trip to Los Angeles was a surreal experience. Emily, who had never left New Jersey, was now on a plane, crossing borders, going to a state where people did things differently. Carmen held her hand throughout the flight, telling stories to distract her from the fear. When they arrived in Los Angeles, the first thing that impressed Emily was the warmth. It was a different warmth from that of the landfill, more clean, more alive. The Montoya's house was beautiful and welcoming, exactly as Carmen had described. The yellow room seemed to come out of a dream. "From today," said Michael after Emily had settled in, "your name will be Laura Montoya. It's a new name for a new life, but only if you want to." Emily, now Laura, agreed. Like Daniel, she also needed to leave her past behind. But unlike him, she would never forget who she really was. The years that followed were of adaptation and discoveries. Carmen and Michael were loving and patient parents. They never forced Laura to call them Mom and Dad, letting that step come naturally. They enrolled her in a good school, provided therapy, to help her deal with her traumas, and more importantly, gave her time to heal her wounds. It was Carmen who discovered Laura's talent for cooking. It all started when the girl showed interest in helping in the kitchen. Her small hands, once used to rummaging through the garbage, now created delicious dishes. "You have a gift," said Carmen, watching how Laura transformed when she was cooking. "It's as if the food speaks to you." Michael encouraged this talent, enrolling her in cooking courses from a young age. At 16, Laura was already known in the neighborhood for her cupcakes, especially the red velvet ones she made with a special recipe. But not all the love and comfort of her new life could completely erase the memories of the past. At night, Laura still dreamed of the landfill, of Daniel, and sometimes, in the darkest nightmares, of Mildred. She kept her old rag doll in a box, now clean and restored, along with newspaper clippings that she managed to find. She obsessively searched for news about Mildred or about some young baseball player named Daniel, but never found anything. On her 18th birthday, Michael and Carmen surprised her with news that would change her life again. "Honey," said Carmen during the celebration dinner, "your father and I have been talking. We know you have a dream of becoming a professional chef." Laura nodded, curious about where that conversation was going. "Well," continued Michael, "we got you a spot at one of the best culinary schools in New York City." Laura's fork fell with a clatter. "Going back to New York, only if you want to," Carmen hastened to say. "We know it can be difficult." "I want to," interrupted Laura, her voice firm. It was time to face her demons. What her adoptive parents didn't know was that Laura had other plans besides studying gastronomy. During all those years, she had nurtured a desire that grew stronger and stronger to find Mildred and make her pay for everything she had done. That night, alone in her room, Laura picked up her old rag doll. "It's time," she whispered to it, "time to go home." What she didn't imagine was that her return to New York would lead her down very different paths than she had planned, and that her encounter with the past would be even more complicated than she could imagine. New York City was as bustling and vibrant as Laura remembered. 13 years had passed, but the energy of the city, that mix of honking taxis and distant sirens, remained exactly the same. Standing on the balcony of her rented apartment in Manhattan, she watched the movement of the street while her notebook displayed news pages about Ryan Sterling and his perfect family. The photos showed Mildred always elegant, smiling next to her husband at charity events. The couple's adopted son, Brian, appeared in some more recent images, a handsome young man with green eyes that made her heart clench for reasons she didn't fully understand. "Looking for new live-in chef," said the ad she had found through her contacts. The Sterling mansion needed someone to run the kitchen, prepare dinners for important guests, take care of the family menu. It was the perfect opportunity. Laura had meticulously prepared for this moment. Her years of study in Los Angeles weren't just to perfect her culinary skills. She also learned how to behave, how to speak correctly, how to dress appropriately. Nothing in her current appearance suggested the girl from the landfill she once was. The phone rang, interrupting her thoughts. It was Carmen. "Mi amor, how are you? Have you settled in okay?" "Yes, Mom," Laura replied, feeling the usual warmth in her chest when using that word. "Everything is fine. Tomorrow I have the interview for that job I told you about." There was a pause on the other end of the line. "Laura, are you sure this is really what you want? Working as a private chef when you could have your own restaurant here in Los Angeles?" Laura closed her eyes. She had told her adoptive parents only part of the truth, that she wanted to return to New York to connect with her roots, that the opportunity to work for an important family would be good for her resume. "It's just temporary, Mom. I need to do this," Carmen sighed. "Just promise you'll be careful. Your father and I feel that there's something you're not telling us." "Everything is fine," Laura lied. "I promise to call every day." After hanging up, Laura turned her attention back to the documents scattered on the table. Her resume was impeccable. Training at the best culinary school in Los Angeles, internships in renowned restaurants, excellent references. All true, but with a small detail altered. Her name. For this interview, she would be Laura Martinez, with no connection to her past as Emily. Her backstory was carefully constructed. Daughter of Argentinians, raised in Los Angeles, newly arrived in New York in search of new professional experiences. The next morning, Laura was standing in front of the mirror, adjusting the beige blazer she had chosen for the interview. Her reflection showed an elegant young woman of 20, perfectly styled brown hair, discreet makeup, impeccable posture. No one would ever guess her past looking at her now. The taxi dropped her off in front of the Sterling mansion, exactly at 9:45 a.m. The place was even more impressive than it looked in the photos. A Mediterranean-style palace with extensive gardens and a privileged view of the ocean. Miss Martinez called a maid who was waiting for her at the gate. "Please come with me. Mrs. Sterling is waiting in the living room." Each step towards that house made Laura's heart beat faster. Years of planning, of emotional preparation, and yet nothing could have fully prepared her for this moment. And then, there she was. Mildred Sterling, sitting elegantly on an Italian leather sofa, hadn't changed as much as Laura expected. The years had been kind to her. Only a few fine lines around her eyes betrayed her age, but that look, that cold and calculating glint, remained exactly the same. "Miss Martinez," said Mildred, indicating the armchair in front of her. "Welcome. I was very impressed with your resume." Laura sat down, keeping her hands firmly crossed on her lap to hide her tremor. "Thank you, Mrs. Sterling. I'm very honored." With this opportunity, the interview proceeded like a carefully choreographed dance. Mildred asked questions about her experience, her culinary specialties, her availability for events. Laura answered everything with rehearsed precision, leaving her true personality carefully hidden under a mask of professionalism. "There's something about you," Mildred commented at one point, tilting her head slightly. "Something familiar." Laura's heart almost stopped, but she kept her expression neutral. "Maybe my accent? Many people comment that I don't sound Argentinian." Mildred shook her head, dismissing the thought. "That must be it." "Well, Miss Martinez, I believe your qualifications are exactly what we're looking for. When could you start?" "Immediately," Laura replied, feeling a mixture of triumph and apprehension. "Great. Helena, our housekeeper, will show you your room in the staff wing. We expect you to join us for dinner tonight. My husband and my son insist on personally meeting who will be running our kitchen." As she followed the housekeeper through the corridors of the mansion, Laura struggled to maintain her composure. She was in. She had gotten what she wanted. But now that she was there, so close to Mildred, the memories she had tried to bury came back in full force. Her room was small but comfortable, with a window that overlooked the back of the garden. After Helena left, Laura finally allowed her hands to tremble, her breathing to get a little out of control. She took out of her bag the old rag doll, now carefully restored, and hid it at the bottom of a drawer. It was her talisman, her anchor to reality, a constant reminder of who she was and why she was there. The rest of the day passed in a blur of instructions about the house, introductions to the kitchen staff, reconnaissance of the territory. Laura absorbed everything mechanically, her mind focused on the dinner that was to come. At 7 p.m. sharp, the sounds of a car arriving announced the return of Ryan and Brian. Laura was in the kitchen, finalizing the menu she had prepared for her first night, a combination of Argentinian and American dishes that she hoped would impress. "So you're our new chef," said a cheerful voice behind her. Laura turned around and her world seemed to stop. There, standing in the kitchen doorway with a warm smile, was Brian Sterling. But it wasn't Brian that she saw, it was Daniel, Daniel, with the same green eyes that had haunted her dreams for 13 years. "Are you okay?" he asked, noticing her sudden pallor. "You look like you've seen a ghost." In a way, she had seen a ghost. And now, standing there in the kitchen of the Sterling mansion, Laura realized that her revenge had just become much more complicated than she had ever imagined. The dinner that first night was an ordeal for Laura. Sitting at the kitchen table, after serving the family, she barely touched her own food, her mind replaying every detail of what had just happened. Daniel, had sat at the dining room table, completely oblivious to the true identity of the new chef. How could he not recognize her? How could he smile and chat casually, as if they were complete strangers? But of course he wouldn't recognize her, she thought bitterly. She was no longer the dirty girl from the landfill, just as he was no longer the boy who shared stale bread with her. Time had transformed both into completely different people, at least on the outside. The days that followed were a constant exercise in self-control. Laura dedicated herself to the kitchen with an intensity that impressed everyone, transforming each meal into a work of art. It was her way of keeping her mind occupied, of not letting herself be consumed by the conflicting feelings that plagued her. But Brian seemed determined to make her mission difficult. He had a habit of showing up in the kitchen at the most unexpected moments, always with that smile that made her heart ache. "You know, Laura," he said one morning while she was preparing breakfast, "there's something about you that seems familiar. Have we met somewhere?" She almost dropped the cup she was holding. "I don't think so, Mr. Sterling. I just arrived from Argentina, remember?" "Please, no, mister," he laughed. "It makes me feel old. And you can just call me Brian." It was torturous to see how he had become exactly the type of person he always dreamed of being. Brian was polite, kind. He had that air of someone who had never known true suffering. Except there were moments when Laura caught something in his eyes, a fleeting shadow that suggested that not everything was as buried as it seemed. One night, while organizing the pantry, Laura heard loud voices coming from the office. It was Mildred, arguing with someone on the phone. "I don't care what you want, Carl," she hissed. "Stay away from my son. You already receive enough money." "To keep quiet." Laura froze. Carl. The name wasn't strange to her, although she couldn't remember exactly where she knew it from. She approached the office door silently. "He's my son, too." The male voice on the other end of the line was loud enough to be heard. "You have no right to anything." Mildred cut him off. The deal was clear. Daniel is Brian now, and Brian is Ryan Sterling's son. End of story. The shock made Laura stumble backwards, accidentally knocking over a can of preserves. The noise alerted Mildred, who opened the door abruptly. "What are you doing here?" she asked, her eyes flashing with anger. "Sorry, Mom," Laura murmured, keeping her eyes down. "I was just organizing the pantry." Mildred studied her for a moment, her eyes narrowed with suspicion. "Well, you're done for today. You can leave." That night, locked in her room, Laura could barely contain her agitation. Daniel wasn't just any boy that Mildred and Ryan had adopted. He was her biological son. With this Carl, another piece of the puzzle fell into place. Another dark secret came to light. In the days that followed, Laura began to pay even more attention to everything that happened in the house. She noticed how Mildred sometimes looked at Brian with a strange, almost possessive expression. How she controlled every aspect of his life, from the clothes he wore to the people he associated with. Brian, in turn, seemed increasingly intrigued by the new chef. He often found her in the kitchen late at night when she was preparing the doughs for the next day. "Can't sleep?" he asked one of those nights, sitting on the high stool near the kitchen island. "I work better in the silence of the night," she replied, trying to keep her voice neutral as she kneaded the bread dough. "I have trouble sleeping too," he confessed. "Sometimes I have these dreams, or maybe they're memories, I'm not sure, of a different place, of a different life." Laura felt her heart race. "What kind of dreams?" "It's strange. There's this girl. I can't see her face clearly, but she's always there. And there's this smell, a bad smell, but somehow familiar." He laughed without humor. "You must think I'm crazy." "No," she replied softly. "I think sometimes our past is trying to tell us something." Brian looked at her differently then, as if trying to see beyond the surface. "You know, when you talk like that, your voice, there's something—" The moment was interrupted by footsteps in the hallway. Mildred appeared in the kitchen doorway, her face a mask of disapproval. "Brian, what are you doing up at this hour and talking to the maid?" "Mom, Laura isn't just a maid, she's our chef," he protested. "And I was just to your room now." Mildred's tone didn't allow for discussion. After Brian left, Mildred turned to Laura. "As for you, I suggest you focus on your duties. I don't pay you to keep my son company." "Yes, ma'am. Sorry, ma'am." Laura kept her eyes down, fighting the urge to scream the whole truth right there, but that wasn't the moment. Not yet. First, she needed to better understand who Carl was, what his true relationship with Daniel was, and why Mildred was so determined to keep this secret. The next morning, while preparing breakfast, Laura noticed something different in Brian's behavior. He seemed quieter, more thoughtful, as if Mildred's words had awakened something in him. "Laura," he called softly, when he was sure they were alone, "that girl in my dreams. Sometimes she was holding a doll, a rag doll, old and dirty, and now I don't know why, but when I look at you—" Laura felt the air leave her lungs. Could it be that he was starting to remember? That beneath the polished surface of Brian Sterling, Daniel still existed? But before she could answer, Mildred entered the kitchen, her high heels tapping authoritatively against the floor. "Brian, your father wants to talk to you in the office. It's about your enrollment in business school." "But Mum, I've already said I want to study physical education. I want to be a baseball coach like I've always dreamed of." "Don't be ridiculous," Mildred cut him off. "You're a Sterling now, and Sterlings don't work with sports. They own the teams." Laura watched the scene with a heavy heart. There was Mildred, once again destroying Daniel's dreams, shaping him according to her ambitions, just like she had done with George, like she had tried to do with herself. That night, alone, in her room, Laura picked up her old rag doll. She caressed the worn fabric, remembering how Daniel always defended her when the other boys from the landfill tried to steal it. "I'm going to bring you back," she whispered to the doll. "I'm going to bring Daniel back, even if it's the last. Good thing I do." What she didn't know was that her plans were about to get even more complicated. Because the next day, an unexpected visit would arrive at the Sterling mansion. Someone who would threaten to expose not only Mildred's secrets, but her own. The morning began hectic at the Sterling mansion. Laura was in the kitchen preparing breakfast when she heard the commotion from the servants. Helena, the housekeeper, entered hurriedly, her normally calm face showing concern. "Mr. Sterling's sister is arriving," she announced. "Mrs. Sterling is furious. No one knew about this visit." Laura continued beating the eggs for the omelette, but her ears were attentive. In a month working at the house, she had never heard of a sister of Ryan. "Amelia Sterling," Helena continued, lowering her voice. "She's an investigative journalist, always involved in some explosive report. Mrs. Sterling hates her." The sound of hurried heels in the hallway interrupted the conversation. Mildred entered the kitchen like a hurricane, her normally controlled face contorted into a mask of irritation. "Laura, prepare a special breakfast. Amelia likes elaborate dishes. She'll want to impress her with your critiques." She ran her hands through her perfectly styled hair. "And please, keep a low profile. My sister-in-law has the terrible habit of asking too many questions." As soon as Mildred left, Laura felt her heart race. An investigative journalist. Maybe it was exactly the ally she needed, but she would need to be very careful. Amelia Sterling arrived an hour later, bringing with her an energy that seemed to electrify the atmosphere of the mansion. She was a woman in her 40s, with short modern hair and perceptive eyes that seemed to absorb every detail. "Bro!" exclaimed Ryan, hugging her warmly. "Why didn't you let us know you were coming?" "And miss the look of surprise on my dear sister-in-law's face?" Amelia laughed, casting an amused glance at Mildred, who forced a smile. "Besides, I'm working on a very interesting story. I thought you'd like to know the details." Brian came down the stairs at that moment, and Amelia's face lit up. "My favorite nephew. Come here. Let me see you properly." While serving breakfast, Laura watched the family interaction. Amelia had a different way of looking at Brian, as if she was always looking for something in his face. "So, Amelia," said Mildred, her voice too sweet, "what's the topic of your new report?" "Oh, it's fascinating," Amelia replied, tasting the omelette that Laura had prepared. "I'm investigating cases of irregular adoptions in New Jersey. You won't believe the amount of stories I've discovered." Laura, who was serving more coffee, saw out of the corner of her eye how Mildred tensed. Her hands, always so firm, trembled slightly as she held the cup. "What kind of stories?" asked Ryan, genuinely interested. "Well, for example," Amelia took a sip of coffee. "I discovered a scheme involving children who were abandoned in specific places to then be found and adopted by hand-picked families. All very well orchestrated, with social workers and even police officers involved. The silence that followed was heavy. Brian seemed absolutely fascinated by the story, while Mildred had completely lost color. "How awful," she said finally. "But that was a long time ago, I imagine." "Not so much," Amelia replied, her eyes fixed on her sister-in-law. "In fact, many of these cases happened in the last 15 years. Including, I found very interesting records about a certain landfill in North New Jersey." The sound of glass breaking interrupted the conversation. Laura had dropped a pitcher of juice, her hands shaking uncontrollably. "I'm sorry," she murmured, bending down to clean up the mess. "Don't worry, dear," said Amelia, getting up to help. When she bent down next to Laura, their eyes met, and for a moment, Laura was sure that Amelia knew exactly who she was. "I think that's enough depressing stories," Mildred cut in, getting up abruptly. "Ryan, didn't you have that meeting today?" "But I just got here," Amelia protested, "and I haven't even told you about the most interesting discoveries. For example, did you know that many of these children were biological children of people involved in the scheme?" Brian, who until then had only been listening, seemed to wake up from a trance. What do you mean? Some people had children that they couldn't or didn't want to take responsibility for, Amelia explained, her eyes never leaving Mildred's face. So they arranged a way to abandon them in specific places, to then be adopted by chosen families. All very convenient, isn't it, Mildred? Mildred's face was ashen. I don't know why you're looking at me like that, Amelia. What are you implying? Nothing, dear sister-in-law. Just sharing my research. Amelia smiled, but her eyes remained serious. By the way, do you know a man named Carl Montoya? The cup that Mildred was holding fell, spilling coffee on the white tablecloth. Brian looked from one to the other, confused. Mum, who's Carl Montoya? Nobody, Mildred replied sharply. Amelia, I think it's best if you leave. We have appointments today. Of course, Amelia stood up calmly. But before I go, I'd like to talk to your new chef. I heard she makes a wonderful Argentinian dessert. Laura felt her heart stop for a second. The look Amelia gave her made it clear that the conversation would be about much more than recipes. Unfortunately, Mildred interjected, Laura is very busy right now. Maybe another time. Oh, don't worry, Amelia smiled. I'm sure we'll meet soon, very soon. After Amelia left, the mansion plunged into a tense silence. Mildred locked herself in the office, from which her raised voice could be heard on the phone. Brian roamed the house like a ghost, clearly disturbed by the mention of Carl's name. Laura was putting away the dishes when Brian entered the kitchen. His face was pale. His hands trembled slightly. Laura, he said, his voice almost a whisper, have you ever had the feeling that your whole life is a lie? She stopped what she was doing, her heart breaking to see the suffering in his eyes. Sometimes, she replied softly, the truth hides in places we don't want to look. That name that my aunt mentioned, Carl Montoya, I've heard it before, in dreams maybe, or memories. He ran his hands over his face. And there's more. Last night, I dreamed again about that girl. She was crying, asking me not to leave. And for the first time, I was able to see her face clearly. Laura held her breath. And she looked like you. Time seemed to stop at that moment. Laura could hear her own heart beating in her ears. She could feel the weight of 13 years of secrets threatening to collapse. Brian, But before she could continue, Mildred burst into the kitchen. Brian, to my office, now! The boy cast one last look at Laura before following his mother. A look that said that conversation was not over. That night in her room, Laura couldn't sleep. Amelia's visit had changed everything. Now it wasn't just her who was after the truth. There was someone with power and resources asking the same questions, digging up the same secrets. She picked up her rag doll, caressing the worn fabric. The time is coming, she whispered. The truth can't stay hidden forever. What she didn't know was that at that very moment, in her office, Mildred was making a call that would change the course of everything. Carl, we have a problem. Amelia is investigating. Yes, that story about the landfill. No, it can't wait. We need to act now. The days that followed Amelia's visit were of palpable tension at the Sterling mansion. Mildred walked through the corridors like a caged lion, making mysterious calls and treating everyone with barely contained irritation. Ryan spent more time away from home, immersed in his commitments with the baseball team, completely oblivious to the tornado that was forming under his own roof. Brian, in turn, had become a silent shadow. Laura watched him through the cracks of the kitchen door, noting how he spent hours sitting in the library, researching something on his notebook. Sometimes their gazes crossed through the room, loaded with unasked questions, with truths almost discovered. On a particularly hot afternoon, while Laura was preparing dinner, Helena entered the kitchen hurriedly. Mr. Brian didn't come down. For lunch today, whispered the housekeeper, glancing nervously over her shoulder. Mrs. Sterling is furious. She ordered you to take a tray to his room. Laura felt her heart race. It was the first time she would have an excuse to go to Brian's room since Amelia's visit. She prepared the tray with special care, including the dishes that she knew were his favorites, the same ones he always praised when she prepared them. She climbed the stairs with measured steps, trying to control the trembling in her hands. When she reached the door of the room, she heard raised voices coming from inside. She stopped, listening. "You can't stop me from looking for the truth, Mom." Brian's voice was filled with a rage that Laura had never heard before. "I found old photos in the basement, documents. Why have you never told me about Carl Montoya?" "I've already said that that man is nobody," Mildred replied, her voice trembling slightly. "Stop digging up the past, Brian. You'll only find lies and manipulations." "Lies? Like the story of my adoption? I found the original papers, Mom. The dates don't match. And there's more. I found a photo of you with Carl from years ago. Why does he look so much like me?" The sound of something breaking made Laura take a step back. The door opened violently, and Mildred came out, almost colliding with her. "What are you doing here?" Mildred asked, her eyes flashing with anger. "You asked me to bring lunch to Mr. Brian," Laura replied, keeping her voice firm despite the fear. Mildred studied her for a moment, as if trying to read her thoughts. "Leave the tray and get out. And don't comment to anyone about what you may have heard." After Mildred left, Laura entered the room hesitantly. Brian was sitting on his bed, his head down, holding something in his hands. An old photo, yellowed by time. "You can come in, Laura," he said without looking up. "Actually, I really wanted to talk to you." She placed the tray on the bedside table and stood still, her heart beating so hard that she was sure he could hear it. "You know," he continued, finally looking at her, "since you arrived, I've been having these dreams, or rather, these memories. It's like your presence has unlocked something inside me." Laura felt her hands begin to tremble. What kind of memories? Of a dark and dirty place, of the smell of garbage, of a girl. He hesitated, studying her face. "A girl who looks more and more like you." The silence that followed was deafening. Laura could feel the moment of truth approaching, like a wave about to break. "And there's more," continued Brian, getting up. He went to his desk and picked up something. A small, broken plastic car, faded by time. "I found this at the bottom of a drawer. I didn't remember it until I saw you for the first time. Now I can't stop thinking, why did I keep this for so long?" Laura felt tears begin to form in her eyes. That car, she had found it for him in the landfill on one of the few happy days they had together. "Daniel!" The name escaped her lips before she could contain herself. Brian froze, the car falling from his hands. "What did you say?" At that moment they were interrupted by a noise coming from the hallway. Mildred had returned, her heels tapping authoritatively against the floor. "I need to go," whispered Laura, turning quickly to leave. "Wait!" Brian grabbed her arm. "How do you know that name? Please tell me the truth." But Laura managed to break free and hurried out of the room, her heart threatening to explode in her chest. She had made a mistake. She had let emotions speak, louder than reason. The rest of the day passed like a blur. Laura concentrated on her mechanical tasks in the kitchen, trying not to think about the look of recognition she had seen in Brian's eyes. At night, when she finally retreated to her room, she found a note that had been slipped under her door. "We need to talk. Tomorrow, 5 a.m., in the garden greenhouse. Please, don't miss it. I need to know the truth. B." Laura held the note against her chest, silent tears running down her face. How could she tell the truth without destroying everything? How could she continue lying when every fiber of her being screamed to reveal who she really was? She picked up her rag doll, her talisman, in moments of doubt. "What do I do?" she whispered to it. "How can I do justice without hurting the people I love even more?" because that was the truth that hurt the most. Despite all her desire for revenge, despite all the hatred she harbored for Mildred, she had fallen in love with Daniel again. Not with the Brian Sterling that everyone knew, but with the boy from the landfill who still lived inside him, who was now beginning to awaken. The sound of a car arriving caught her attention. Through the window of her room, Laura saw a man getting out of a taxi, tall, dark-haired, with the same green eyes as Brian. Her heart stopped for a moment when she recognized the figure. It was the man who had picked up Daniel from the landfill 13 years ago. Carl Montoya. Mildred hurried out to greet him, taking him quickly into the house. Their raised voices could be heard even through the walls. "She knows too much," Carl was saying. "Amelia is about to publish the article. We need to act now." "We can't do anything rash," Mildred replied. "Brian is already too suspicious, and there's more. That Argentinian chef. There's something strange about her." Laura felt a chill run down her spine. She needed to make a decision, and it needed to be quick. The meeting with Brian the next morning could be her only chance to reveal the truth before Mildred and Carl tried to silence her. Lying in her bed, unable to sleep, Laura mentally reviewed everything that had happened since she had arrived at that house. Each conversation with Brian, each look exchanged, each moment in which he almost revealed her secret. Now with Carl in the mix, the danger was even greater. "Tomorrow," she promised herself, pressing the doll against her chest. "Tomorrow the truth will come out, no matter the cost." What she didn't know was that Mildred also had plans for the next morning, plans that could change the course of everything before the sun even rose. The clock hadn't yet struck 5 in the morning when Laura left her room silently. The mansion was plunged into a heavy silence, broken only by the ticking of the antique clock in the hallway. In her hands, she clutched her rag doll. She had decided that it was time to use it as proof of her true identity. The garden was covered by a soft mist, typical of winter mornings in New Jersey. The greenhouse, a Victorian structure at the back of the grounds, emerged from the fog like a crystal palace. The exotic plants that Mildred was so proud of cultivating created strange shadows on the glass walls. Brian was already there, pacing, back and forth, his silhouette outlined against the dim morning light. When Laura entered, he stopped, his eyes immediately fixing on the doll in her hands. "You came," he said, his voice a mixture of relief and apprehension. "We need to talk," Laura replied, closing the greenhouse door behind her. "There's something you need to know." "Is it about yesterday? About you having called me?" He hesitated, as if the word were difficult to pronounce. "Daniel," Laura nodded, taking a step towards him. "It's about that, yes, and about much more, about who you really are, about who I am." "Who you are?" Brian frowned. "What do you mean?" With trembling hands, Laura extended the doll to him. "Do you recognize this?" Brian took the doll, his fingers caressing the worn fabric as if he were in a trance. This was in my dreams. The girl. She always carried a doll like this." "Those weren't dreams, Daniel," Laura said softly. "They were memories of the landfill, remember? Of the place where we grew up together." Brian's face lost all color. He staggered back, holding onto a plant table to avoid falling. "No, it can't be. I was adopted from an orphanage. My mom—" "Mildred lied," Laura cut him off, "about everything, about your adoption, about your biological father, Carl Montoya, the man who's here in the mansion now, and about me." Brian looked at her as if he was seeing her for the first time. Who are you?" "In the landfill you knew me as Emily, the girl that Mildred abandoned after killing my father." Laura felt tears begin to run down her face. "Your best friend, who you promised never to forget." The impact of the revelation was visible on Brian's face. He looked from the doll to Laura, his hands shaking violently. "Emily," he whispered, his voice choked. "But How? I was adopted by an Argentinian family, she explained. I changed my name to Laura. I studied gastronomy. I prepared for years for this moment, to find Mildred, to get justice. Justice, he repeated, still seeming stunned. What do you mean? Your mother, Mildred. She killed my father, Laura revealed, her voice trembling with contained emotion. She made it look like an accident. She manipulated your father, Ryan, to believe that he was to blame. And then she abandoned me in the landfill, as if I were trash. Brian staggered back, his breathing becoming irregular. Memories began to flood his mind, flashes of the landfill, of Emily, of moments he had buried so deep that he didn't even know they still existed. I remember, he murmured, running his hands over his face. I remember you, your doll, the nights we spent hungry, the dreams we shared. And do you remember the promise, Laura asked softly, that you would come back for me? Brian let out a broken sob. Forgive me. Forgive me for having forgotten, for having let them transform me into someone else. Laura approached him, touching his face gently. It wasn't your fault. We were children. Mildred manipulated everything, as she always did. At that moment, a noise at the greenhouse door made them separate abruptly. Mildred was standing there, her face a mask of controlled fury. Behind her, Carl watched the scene with an indecipherable expression. What a touching scene, said Mildred, her voice cutting like ice. Little Emily coming back to take revenge. I must admit, I didn't expect you to be so persistent. Nah, it's over, Mildred, Laura replied, standing firm despite the fear that ran through her veins. Brian, Daniel, knows the truth now, about who he is, about who you are. Is that so? Mildred laughed, a humorless sound. And what do you intend to do with that truth? Destroy his family, ruin the life that I've built so carefully. You didn't build anything, exploded Brian, taking a step forward. You stole my true identity. You stole my friendship with Emily. You stole the life of her father. Watch what you say, kid, Carl interjected, speaking for the first time. Your mother did what was best for you. Best for me? Brian laughed, bitterly. Separate me from the only person who really cared about me? Make me forget who I was? I care about you, Mildred shouted, losing her composure. Everything I did was for you, to give you a better life. Liar! Laura's voice cut through the air like a whip. You've never cared about anyone but yourself. You used my father, you used Carl, you use Ryan to this day. We're all pawns in your game of ambition. Mildred took a threatening step towards Laura, but Brian placed himself between them. Don't you dare touch her, he said, his voice filled with an authority that Laura had never heard before. You still don't get it, do you? Mildred smiled, a cold and calculating smile. You have no choice. None of you do. If this story comes out, everyone loses. You lose your inheritance, your name, everything you know. And your dear Emily, well, accidents happen. Are you threatening me? Laura asked, feeling a courage she didn't know she had. Just stating facts, Mildred replied. Carl, get the girl. Let's resolve this once and for all. But before Carl, oh, good move, another voice sounded from the greenhouse door. You won't touch anyone. Everyone turned around. Amelia was standing there, her cell phone raised, clearly recording the entire conversation. Beside her, Ryan watched the scene with an expression of horror and disbelief. Ryan, Mildred took a step back, her face losing all color. It's not what you think. No? Ryan's voice was filled with deep pain. Then it's not true that you killed this girl's father? That you made me believe that I was to blame? That you manipulated this whole situation with Daniel? I can explain. Enough explanations, Mildred, Amelia cut in. The police are on their way. I have all the evidence, the false adoption documents, the money transfers to Carl, everything. It's over. The sound of sirens began to sound in the distance. Mildred looked around like a cornered animal, her eyes jumping from one face to another, looking for a way out. "Carl," she called, her voice trembling. "Do something." But Carl was already moving away, his hands raised in surrender. "I'm sorry, Mildred. I'm not going down with you." At that moment, seeing Mildred finally lose control, Laura felt something unexpected. Pity. Pity for that woman who had built her whole life on lies, who had hurt so many people in her insatiable pursuit of power and status. Brian, or Daniel, he still needed to decide who he really was, approached her, taking her hand. "It's over," he whispered. "It's finally over." Laura squeezed his hand back, feeling the tears run freely down her face. Yes, it was over, but something new was just beginning. The hours that followed the confrontation in the greenhouse seemed to happen in slow motion. The Sterling mansion, once a monument to perfection and order, had transformed into a scene of emotional chaos. Ryan was sitting in his favorite armchair in the library, a glass of untouched whiskey in his hands, while Amelia organized the documents that would prove all the accusations against Mildred. Laura and Brian, who now everyone knew to be Daniel, were sitting on the living room sofa, still processing everything that had happened. Their hands remained intertwined, as if fearing that by letting go, everything could disappear like a dream. "I can't believe it," murmured Ryan for the 10th time, running his hands over his tired face. "All these years, she made me carry the guilt for George's death, knowing that it had been her." "It wasn't your fault, Dad," Daniel said softly. It was the first time he had used that word since the revelations, and Ryan raised his eyes, surprised. "I may not be your biological son, but you were more of a father to me than Carl ever was." Ryan stood up, crossing the room to hug his son. "You will always be my son, no matter what name you choose to use." Laura watched the scene with tears. In her eyes, it was strange to see how true love could survive even amidst so many lies. "Miss Laura," called Amelia, approaching with some papers in her hand. "We need to talk about your testimony. There are some things that need to be clarified." "You can just call me Laura," she replied, straightening up on the sofa. "And yes, I want to tell everything, every detail of what Mildred did to my father, to me, to Daniel." "Emily," interrupted Daniel softly, "to me, you will always be Emily." She smiled through the tears. "And you will always be my Daniel." Amelia cleared her throat discreetly. "Well, I think we need to decide how we're going to proceed. The police took Mildred, but she has resources, connections. It's not going to be an easy battle." "It doesn't matter," said Ryan firmly. "I'm going to make sure she pays for everything she did. I've already contacted my lawyers." At that moment, Helena entered the room, her normally serene face marked by worry. "Mr. Sterling, there are some reporters in front of the house. It seems someone leaked the story." Amelia sighed. "It was inevitable. A story like this, it's the kind of thing the press loves. I don't want to talk to anyone yet," Daniel said, squeezing Laura's hand tighter. I need to understand who I am first." "No one's going to pressure you," Ryan assured. "We're going to handle this our way, in our time." Laura noticed that Daniel was trembling slightly. "Are you okay?" she whispered. "I don't know," he replied. "Honestly, it's like my whole life was a puzzle, and someone just showed me that all the pieces were in the wrong place." "I understand," she said, resting her head on his shoulder. "When I was adopted by the Montoya family, I also had to rebuild who I was. It's not easy, but it's possible." Amelia watched them with interest. "You too. The connection you have is extraordinary. It survived 13 years of separation, all of Mildred's manipulations." "Some things are stronger than time," Laura replied simply. The night wore on, and little by little the adrenaline gave way to weariness. Helena made tea for everyone, and the silence that settled in the room was almost comfortable. The silence of people who could finally breathe without the weight of secrets. "What happens now?" asked Brian Daniel finally, his voice small like that of the boy he once was. "Now," replied Amelia, "we start to rebuild. The truth is already out there. It can no longer be buried. But how we deal with it, that depends on us." "I want to go back to the landfill," Laura said suddenly. Everyone looked at her, surprised. "Not to stay," she explained quickly, "but I need to see Shirley. She needs to know that I'm okay, that we managed." Brian Daniel nodded. "I'm going with you. I owe her that too." "Tomorrow," said Ryan. "Today we all need to rest. It was an intense day." Later, when everyone had retired, Laura remained awake in her room, looking out the window. The rag doll was in her lap, as it always had been in the most important moments of her life. A soft knock on the door startled her. It was Brian Daniel. "Can I come in?" he asked hesitantly. Laura nodded and he entered, closing the door silently behind him. For a moment, they just looked at each other, as if they still didn't believe they were really there. "You know," he began, sitting on the edge of the bed, "I spent years having these dreams, these memories that didn't make sense. Now I understand why I never managed to feel completely Brian Sterling. Part of me always knew there was something more." "And how do you feel about that?" she asked softly, lost, confused, but also free. He took the doll from her hands, examining it carefully. "I remember the day I defended you when the older boys wanted to steal it." Laura smiled. "You always defended me. You were always my protector." "And I failed," he said, his voice breaking. "I left you alone in that place." "No." She touched his face, making him look at her. "You were a child, Daniel. You had no choice. And look at us now. We found each other again. That's not failure, it's destiny." He held her hand against his face, closing his eyes. "When I saw you for the first time in the kitchen, I felt something, like my heart recognized you before my brain did." "I felt it too," she admitted. "That's why it was so hard to maintain my disguise. Every time you smiled at me, every time you showed up in the kitchen to talk, it was as if time hadn't passed." "And it hasn't," he said, opening his eyes to look at her. "Not for what matters." He leaned in slowly, and when their lips met, it was as if all the pieces finally clicked into place. The kiss was soft, full of promises and of a love that had survived time, distance, and all the lies. When they separated, Laura rested her forehead on his. "Tomorrow," she whispered, "we begin our new story." "Our true story," he corrected. Outside the room, Ryan passed by the hallway and heard the soft voices. He stopped for a moment, a sad smile on his face. So many years lost, so many lives affected by Mildred's power games. But there, in that small room, two souls that had been separated by cruelty were finally reuniting. It was a beginning, a new beginning for all of them. The next morning dawned cloudy, as if the sky reflected the emotional weight of that day. Laura and Daniel, he had decided to go back to using his original name, were in Ryan's car on their way to the landfill. The silence between them was dense, loaded with memories and apprehension. "Are you sure you want to do this? Are you okay back there?" Ryan asked through the rearview mirror, clearly concerned about the two young adults. He had insisted on driving them himself, refusing to let them face this moment alone. "We need to," Laura replied, her hand clasped tightly in Daniel's. "We need to close this chapter." As they approached, the landscape began to change. The luxurious buildings gave way to simpler constructions. The well-paved streets turned into dirt roads. And then, finally, it loomed before them, the landfill, almost exactly as it had been 13 years ago. My God, Daniel whispered, his face paling. The smell, it's exactly how I remembered it. Laura squeezed his hand tighter. She too was hit by a wave of memories, some painful, others surprisingly sweet. Here was the place where she had lost everything, but also where she had found a love that had stood the test of time. Ryan parked the car a safe distance away, and the three got out. The ground was damp from the previous night's rain, and their shoes sank slightly into the dirt, mixed with trash. There, Laura pointed, indicating an area where several makeshift shacks stood. That's where Shirley lived, where we lived. They began to walk towards the shacks, attracting curious glances from the people working to sort the trash. Children stopped their games to watch them, their big, distrustful eyes, painfully reminding Laura and Daniel of themselves. A woman approached them, her clothes simple but clean, her face etched with time, but still maintaining an impressive dignity. "Can I help you?" she asked, studying the visitors with curiosity. "We're looking for Shirley," Laura replied, her voice trembling slightly. "Is she still Shirley?" The woman smiled. "Of course. She's still taking care of the children, as always. Come, I'll take you to her." They followed the woman through the shacks, each step bringing more memories to the surface. This was where they played hide and seek. This was where they shared the leftover food they found. This was where Daniel had defended Laura from the older boys. And then finally, they arrived at Shirley's shack. It was different, more structured, with simple brick walls replacing the old boards. But the clothesline with colorful clothes and the small makeshift garden in old cans were exactly as they remembered. "Shirley," the woman called out, "there are some people here who want to see you." For a moment, nothing happened. Then the door opened and there she was. Shirley had aged, her hair now completely white, but her eyes still had that spark of kindness that had saved so many lives. She looked at the visitors, first with curiosity, then with growing recognition. Her eyes widened, her hand flew to cover her mouth. "Good heavens," she whispered. "It can't be my little flower, my boy." Laura couldn't contain herself. She ran into Shirley's arms, tears streaming freely down her face. Daniel followed her, and soon the three were embracing, sobbing and laughing at the same time. "You came back," Shirley repeated between tears. "You really came back." Ryan watched the scene from afar, his own face etched with emotion. Seeing his son, because Daniel would always be his son, reconnecting with his past was deeply moving to him. Shirley led them into the shack. The space was small but welcoming, with photos of dozens of children covering the walls, all of whom she had helped over the years. Sit down," she said, hurrying to make coffee. "I want to know everything. How did you find each other? How—" She stopped, noticing something familiar in Laura's hands. The old rag doll. "You kept it," Shirley said softly. "I kept everything," Laura replied. "The memories, the love, the hope. And now we finally have justice." During the next few hours, they told Shirley everything. About how Laura had been adopted by the Argentinian family, about how Daniel had become Brian, about Mildred's manipulations, and how it had all finally come to light. Shirley listened attentively, occasionally wiping away a tear, other times squeezing their hands in silent support. "I always knew there was something wrong with the way you were taken from here," she said to Daniel. "That man, Carl, there was something in his eyes that I didn't like. He was my biological father," Daniel revealed bitterly. "Part of Mildred's plan from the beginning." "But Ryan," Shirley interjected, looking at the man who remained respectfully distant. "He is your true father. Love doesn't need blood to be real." Ryan then approached, his eyes glistening with suppressed tears. "Shirley, I want to thank you for taking care of them when I couldn't, for being the light when everything was dark. Shirley smiled, taking his hands in hers. No need to thank me. Every child who comes through here takes a piece of my heart, and these two were always special. As they talked, several children approached, curious about the visitors. Laura and Daniel watched them with a mixture of pain and hope. They were like reflections of themselves 13 years ago. Do you still take care of all of them? Laura asked. All that I can, Shirley replied, but it's harder now. Money is tight, donations have decreased. Daniel and Laura exchanged a meaningful look. Without needing to say a word, they knew what they needed to do. Shirley, Daniel began, we want to help, not just with money, but with a real project, something that can give these children a better future. We can create a training center, Laura continued, picking up the cue. Teach culinary skills, other trades, give them the opportunities we didn't have. Ryan stepped forward. Count me in too. I can use my influence to get support, sponsorships. Shirley's eyes filled with tears again. You really are special, always have been. When they finally said goodbye, it was already evening. Shirley hugged them tightly, as if wanting to make up for all the lost years. Come back often, she asked. Don't let success erase your roots. Never, Laura promised. This place, as difficult as it was where I found my first true love. She looked at Daniel, who smiled back. On the way back home, the silence in the car was different, lighter, more hopeful. Laura and Daniel still had much to process, much to heal, but now they had something new, a purpose. You know, Daniel said, breaking the silence, I think I finally understand something. It doesn't matter if I'm Daniel or Brian, if I'm Carl's son or Ryan's. What matters is who I choose to be from now on. Laura leaned her head on his shoulder. And who do you choose to be? Someone who makes a difference, he replied simply. Someone who turns pain into hope. Ryan smiled through the rearview mirror, his heart overflowing with pride. His son, always his son, had found his way back not only to his childhood, sweetheart, but to himself. And as the car drove away from the landfill, leaving behind the shadows of the past, everyone knew that this was not an end, but a new beginning. A beginning built not on lies and manipulations, but on love, truth, and the desire to make a difference. The days following the visit to the landfill were filled with intense changes in everyone's lives. The Sterling mansion, once a monument to Mildred's superficial perfection, was beginning to transform into a real home. Ryan had decided to donate much of the furniture and objects that reminded him of his ex-wife, replacing them with more welcoming pieces chosen together with Daniel and Laura. The news about the case had exploded in the media, as expected. Amelia had published her report, a meticulous work that exposed not only Mildred's crimes, but also raised important questions about irregular adoptions and influence peddling. The article had caused a national outcry and initiated a series of investigations into other powerful families. One particularly sunny morning, as Laura was preparing breakfast, now no longer as a maid but as part of the family, Daniel came into the kitchen with a serious expression on his face. I just spoke with the lawyer, he said, sitting down. On the high stool at the kitchen island, Mildred is trying to make a deal. Laura stopped what she was doing, her heart beating slightly faster. What kind of deal? She wants to confess everything. Your father's death, the abandonment, the manipulations with my adoption, in exchange for a reduced sentence. He ran his hands over his face, clearly disturbed. Said she has more information about other similar cases. Typical of her, Laura commented bitterly. Always negotiating, always manipulating. Ryan, who had entered the kitchen in time to hear the conversation, approached the two. The decision is yours. If you want to take the case to the end, I'm with you. If you prefer to accept the deal and end this once and for all, I don't know if I can end it, Laura admitted, her hands trembling slightly as she poured the coffee. I spent so long planning my revenge, imagining the moment she would pay for everything. And now... Daniel took her hand, interlacing his fingers with hers. And now you've realized that revenge isn't as satisfying as you imagined. Something like that, she smiled sadly. It's like all the hate I've held onto all these years has lost its power after I found you again, after we went back to the landfill. After we found a greater purpose, he completed. Ryan watched their interaction with a mixture of pride and admiration. It was amazing how they had matured through pain, how they had transformed their suffering into something positive. Speaking of which, he said, the architects sent the first drafts for the training center. They want to schedule a meeting to present the blueprints. Laura's face lit up. In recent weeks, she and Daniel had dedicated themselves intensely to the project of transforming an area near the landfill into a vocational training center. The idea was to offer courses in culinary arts, computer skills, crafts, and other skills that could give new opportunities to the children and young people of the region. Shirley was so excited when we showed her the first sketches, Daniel commented, a soft smile on his face. She said she always dreamed of something like this, but never had the resources. Now she will, Ryan replied. And not just financial resources, but all the institutional support she needs. I've already talked to some business friends, and they all want to participate. At that moment, Helena entered the kitchen with a worried expression. Mr. Sterling, there's someone here who wants to talk to you. It's Carl. The silence that followed was heavy. Carl had not been arrested like Mildred. There was not enough evidence of his direct involvement in the crimes, but he had disappeared after the story came to light. What does he want? Daniel asked, his voice tense. He said he wants to do the right thing, Helena replied, that he has important information and wants to help. Ryan looked at Daniel, waiting for his reaction. It was a delicate moment. Carl was, after all, his biological father. I don't want to see him, Daniel said firmly. He had 13 years to do the right thing. Now it's too late. Are you sure? Laura asked softly. Not that he deserves it, but maybe you need this conversation to move on completely. Daniel was silent for a moment, considering. You're right, he said finally, but I don't want to talk to him alone. I want you and my father, my real father, with me. Ryan felt his heart squeeze with emotion upon hearing those words. Always, son. Always. The meeting with Carl was tense but necessary. The man seemed to have aged years in just a few weeks, his face marked by the weight of guilt and regret. I know I don't deserve forgiveness, he began, sitting uncomfortably in the living room. But I want you to know, Daniel, leaving you at that landfill was the biggest mistake of my life. No, Daniel interrupted, his voice firm. Your biggest mistake was not having done anything to fix it in the 13 years that followed. You knew where I was, you knew I was your son, and yet you allowed Mildred to continue with her manipulations. Carl lowered his head, unable to sustain his son's gaze. She had power over me. She knew things that could destroy me. And now, Laura interjected, what's changed now? Now I have nothing left to lose, he replied simply, and maybe I can still do something right before it's too late. In the hours that followed, Carl told everything. Every sordid detail of his relationship with Mildred, every scheme he knew about, every person involved in irregular adoptions over the years. When he finally left, Daniel was emotionally exhausted but also lighter, as if a weight had been lifted from his shoulders. How do you feel? Laura asked, hugging him. Like I can finally close a chapter, he replied, kissing her forehead. I haven't forgiven him. I don't know if I ever will, but at least now I understand the whole story better. And that helps us build our future, she completed. That night, sitting in the garden under the stars, Laura, Daniel, and Ryan talked about the next steps. The training center was progressing rapidly, and there was already a waiting list of young people wanting to enroll in the courses. You know, Laura said, playing with her old rag doll, I never imagined my story would end like this. When I came back to Brazil, I was so focused on revenge and found something better, Daniel completed, holding her hand. Found a purpose. We found, she corrected, together. Ryan watched the two with a smile. It was amazing how love could transform even the saddest stories into something beautiful. What do you think about having a special dinner tomorrow? He suggested, to celebrate the start of construction on the center. Great idea, Laura cheered. I can prepare that pasta that Daniel likes so much. With the sauce you made at the landfill? Daniel asked, his eyes shining with the memory. That was just water and salt, she laughed. Now I can do something much better. The three of them laughed, and in that moment, under the starry New Jersey sky, everything seemed possible. The past, with all its pain and betrayals, was finally beginning to fade away, giving way to a future full of hope and purpose. The rag doll in Laura's lap was now more than a memory of difficult times. It was a symbol of survival, of true love, of transformation. And as the stars shone upon them, Laura knew that she had found much more than revenge. She had found her true family, her true home. 6 months had passed since the great revelations that had forever changed everyone's lives. The Shirley Vocational Training Center, as it was named, was finally ready for its inauguration. The modern building, built near the landfill but without, taking away the livelihoods of the scavengers, shone under the morning sun like a beacon of hope. Laura was in her room in the Sterling mansion, now also her home, adjusting the yellow dress she had chosen, especially for the occasion. On the dresser, her old rag doll occupied a prominent place, completely restored, but maintaining that air of simplicity that made it so special. You look beautiful, Daniel said, standing in the doorway. He watched her with that look that still made her heart race, even after all these months together. You don't look too bad yourself, she joked, admiring how elegant he looked in his navy blue suit. The truth is that Daniel had flourished in recent months. After much conversation with Ryan and Laura, he decided to legally keep the name Brian, but use Daniel among those closest to him. They are two parts of who I am, he explained, and I don't want to deny either of them. The first guests are already arriving, he informed her, offering her his arm, including your parents. Miguel and Carmen Montoya had arrived from Argentina the day before, overflowing with pride for their daughter. Seeing Laura fulfilled, transforming her pain into something positive, was everything they had always wanted for her. Downstairs, Ryan adjusted his tie in front of the mirror in the living room. At his side, Amelia, who had become a constant presence in the house, was putting the finishing touches on her inauguration speech. I still can't believe we did it, he said, his voice choked with emotion. In 6 months, we turned a project into reality. It's the power of true love, Amelia replied, smiling, and the determination of 2 children who refused to let the past define their future. The center was much more than a simple place for vocational courses. There was a complete industrial kitchen where Laura would teach culinary arts, several computer labs, craft workshops, and even a small baseball field where Daniel would realize his dream of being a sports coach. But the heart of the project was the space dedicated to psychological support, where children and young people in vulnerable situations could receive the necessary support to process their traumas and rebuild their lives. When they arrived at the inauguration site, hundreds of people were already waiting, community residents, authorities, business people who had supported the project, and of course, Shirley, radiant in her new dress, surrounded by her children. "My little flower," she exclaimed upon seeing Laura hugging her tightly. "Just look at you, so beautiful, so strong." Laura felt tears begin to form in her eyes. "All of this is because of you, Shirley. You taught us what true love is." The inauguration ceremony was emotional. Ryan opened the speeches, talking about transformation and second chances. Amelia presented a short documentary about the history of the project, showing images of the before and after, interviews with residents of the region, and emotional testimonials. When it was Laura and Daniel's turn to speak, a respectful silence fell over the audience. Hand in hand, they approached the microphone. 13 years ago, Laura began, her voice firm despite the emotion. Two frightened children found each other in the midst of garbage and hopelessness. They promised never to forget each other, promised to come back for each other. "Fate separated us," Daniel continued, "but love brought us back together. And today, we are here not only to fulfill that old promise, but to make a new one. The promise that no other child will have to go through what we went through." Miguel and Carmen wept openly, proud of the daughter they had raised. Ryan kept a protective arm around Amelia's shoulders, who had become much more than a sister-in-law to him. She was a true partner in the mission to make a difference. The doors of the center were officially opened, and people began to enter. To see the facilities, Laura and Daniel remained on stage for a moment longer, observing the movement. "You know what's most amazing? Mildred thought she was destroying us, but she actually made us stronger," she said softly. It was true. Mildred, who was now serving her sentence in a maximum security prison, had lost everything: money, status, power. But her last act of cruelty had resulted in something beautiful: the union of two souls who refused to be defined by hate. Carl was also present at the inauguration, keeping discreetly to the back of the auditorium. He and Daniel were still building a complicated relationship, full of rough edges, but based on the honesty that had been lacking for so many years. After the official ceremony, there was a small celebration in the center's garden. Laura had personally prepared the buffet, including her famous cupcakes that were so successful back in Buenos Aires. At one point, she moved away from the party a little, going to a bench under a leafy tree. From her purse, she took out her inseparable rag doll. "We did it, didn't we?" she whispered to it. "We managed to transform all that pain into something beautiful." Daniel found her there, sitting down beside her. Without saying anything, he took something from his pocket, the small, broken plastic car that he had kept for so many years. "I think they deserve to participate in the party too," he said, placing the car next to the doll. Laura leaned her head on his shoulder, feeling a peace she had never experienced before. There they were, the four of them, the girl from the landfill and her doll, the dreamy boy and his broken car, finally complete, finally home. "Daniel," she called softly. "Remember that promise you made, that you would come back to get me when you had a big house?" He smiled, kissing her forehead. "I remember. Why? Because now we have something much bigger than a house. We have a place where we can really make a difference." At that moment, a group of children ran past them, laughing and playing. They were the first students of the center, children who, like them one day, only needed a chance, someone who believed in them. Ryan approached the couple, his eyes shining with pride. "Ready for the official photo?" They got up, but before joining the others, Laura carefully placed the doll and the car on a small shelf in the center's reception area, a permanent reminder of where it all began. The photo brought everyone together. Laura and Daniel in the center, Ryan and Amelia at their side, Miguel and Carmen radiant, Shirley with her maternal smile, and all the children from the project around them. It was more than just a photograph. It was a portrait of a new beginning. Later, as the party was already ending and the sun was setting on the horizon, Laura and Daniel returned to the shelf where they had left their childhood treasures. "Did you know that I still have that list of dreams we made at the landfill?" he revealed. "I found it the other day, kept together with the car." "And did we realize any of them?" she asked, curious. "Actually," he smiled, "we realized something much better, because on that list we only dreamed of getting out of the landfill. We never imagined that one day we would come back to help others get out too." Laura felt her heart fill with love and gratitude. She looked at the rag doll, her faithful companion in so many difficult moments, and knew that she had finally found her true purpose. It wasn't about revenge, it never was. It was about healing, about transformation, about making the world a better place, even if it was just a small piece of it at a time. "Hey, you two!" Ryan called from the door. "Let's go. We still have that special dinner to celebrate." Daniel took Laura's hand, interlacing his fingers with hers. "Let's go home." "Let's go," she replied, smiling, "to our real home." And so, leaving behind the doll and the car as silent guardians of their story, they walked towards the future. No longer children lost in the landfill, but adults who had learned that love is the greatest force of transformation there is. Because sometimes you have to lose everything to find something much greater. Sometimes you have to go through the darkness to learn to create light. And sometimes, just sometimes, what begins as a story of revenge can turn into the most beautiful story of love and redemption.